Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. Our town had always been quiet, the kind of place where names carried more power than laws, and no name weighed heavier than Langridge. For 80 years, they owned the streets we walked, the fields we worked, and even the stories we told. Their mansion stood on the hill like a watchtower, its white columns gleaming through every season, a reminder that nothing happened here without their blessing. People smiled when they spoke of the Langridges, but their smiles never reached their eyes. You could feel it in the air, the hush that followed whenever their name was mentioned, the way conversations died like the sound of a clock stopping mid-tick. No one ever questioned them. They gave money to the church, threw grand festivals, and sent their children to the best schools. But every now and then, something strange would slip through the cracks, a worker who vanished after a summer harvest, a maid who left without collecting her pay, a piece of land quietly fenced off and forgotten. Still, the town looked away. Because when the Langridge smiled, you smiled back. That was how things worked. That was how they stayed in power. Their garden was their pride, acres of manicured hedges and blooming roses, the kind of beauty that drew photographers and wedding parties from miles away. But the Langridges guarded it fiercely, especially one corner near the far wall, where the earth always seemed too soft, too freshly turned. Most thought nothing of it. Until the day the workers came to expand the irrigation lines, and their shovels struck something that wasn't stone, wasn't root, something that made a sound no one ever forgets. At first, people said it couldn't be true. The Langridges were untouchable, their home a monument to respectability. But as the dirt gave way, and the first shape emerged from the earth, everything changed. The garden that once bloomed with roses began to reek of decay, and the legend of the Langridge family started to unravel with the wind that carried the scent. 7 graves. Unmarked, unspoken, hidden in plain sight for decades. The town that once worshipped the Langridges now whispered a different story, one buried in their soil, waiting for someone brave, or foolish enough, to dig it back up. The story must begin with a tone that feels heavy with memory, a stillness that carries the weight of a century of silence. The opening line should not rush or startle, but instead draw the audience into a slow, creeping realization that something has always been wrong beneath the calm surface of this small town. The Langridge name should enter like a shadow, not shouted, not introduced with grandeur, but mentioned in a way that makes the listener immediately aware of its dominance. The first breath of the story needs to make it clear that this family is not just part of the town's history, they are its history, woven into its land, its rituals, its very sense of belonging. Their presence must feel unshakable, as if the earth itself bends in their favor. In this opening, the town becomes a living organism. Its streets are too quiet, its people too polite, its rhythm too predictable. The narrator's voice should feel reflective, as if remembering something long suppressed. The tone should carry an unspoken warning that peace built on fear is only ever temporary. By establishing the Langridges as the silent rulers, the audience is immediately placed in a world where power is inherited, not earned, and where the passage of time has not weakened that power but calcified it. For 80 years, the Langridge family's control should feel both admired and resented. They are the kind of people whose generosity feeds the town, but whose influence suffocates it. The imagery in this section should emphasize permanence. Describe the Langridge estate perched above the town like a monument, its windows glowing through fog or summer heat, a reminder that their watch never ends. Their name should feel like something everyone carries on their paychecks, their deeds, their tongues. Even those who have never spoken to a Langridge should feel their reach in the air they breathe. Yet, under this admiration, there is unease. People talk about them in careful tones, their praise rehearsed, their silence deliberate. The family's power is not maintained through violence or laws but through expectation, a collective understanding that questioning them brings consequences that no one wants to face. The first moments of the story should invite the audience into this tension between reverence and fear. The Langridges are not villains in the traditional sense. They are far more dangerous because they appear ordinary. Their control is quiet, inherited, and absolute. It is in the way the townspeople walk a little straighter when passing their gate, the way the mayor's voice lowers when their name is mentioned, the way the church bells seem to echo longer near their land. From the very first lines, the world must feel like it belongs to them, and that belonging is what makes everything that follows inevitable. But what kind of power needs to be buried to survive? And what happens when the very ground, tended for generations, finally decides to speak? The introduction of the Langridge family must evoke an almost mythic presence, the kind that feels larger than life yet disturbingly real. They are not simply wealthy or influential, they are institutions unto themselves. The town's rhythm beats to the pulse of their decisions, their charity, their whims. To describe them is to describe power disguised as grace. The narrator should reveal them through the eyes of the townspeople, a mixture of admiration and quiet dread. People talk about the Langridges as if they are both royalty and curse, figures too refined to be human but too present to be legend. Each generation of the family should feel like a continuation of the last, their faces eerily similar in portraits that line the mansion's hallways, their smiles practiced and unchanging. Their legacy should be described through details that feel ceremonial. The way they hosted grand summer parties for the town, ensuring every guest felt seen but never equal. The way the patriarch's handshake sealed every major business deal in town for decades. The way their children were educated elsewhere, only to return with the same measured poise, ready to inherit their place in the town's quiet hierarchy. Every description must carry a sense of performance, a deliberate curation of perfection that hides something colder underneath. The Langridges must feel like masters of appearances, people who know that true control isn't maintained through fear but through loyalty, through the illusion of benevolence. There's also an element of seduction in their power. They give back to the town, but always in ways that ensure dependency, a new library built in their name, a yearly harvest festival sponsored by their estate, a scholarship for the mayor's son. Their kindness is currency, and every act of generosity buys silence. The town doesn't just respect them, it needs them. And that need becomes a quiet kind of imprisonment. The Langridge's influence seeps into everything, the schools that teach their history, the church sermons that praise their faith, the land deeds that all trace back to their signature. Their wealth is not just in money but in control of narrative. Even nature seems to obey them. Their estate sits on a hill where sunlight always seems to linger, their gardens bloom longer than anyone else's, and their walls are untouched by the decay that claims other homes. It's as though the world itself conspires to keep them untouched by time. Yet, beneath that surface perfection, the narrator must let the audience feel the faint tremor of something unspoken, an imbalance that no one names but everyone senses. The Langridge's rule, so long and seamless, should feel like a spell cast over the town, beautiful, unbreakable, and hiding something that was never meant to be seen. The town itself must feel like a living entity, a character that breathes and listens, that knows far more than it dares to speak. It's a place that looks peaceful from the outside, the kind of town that might appear on postcards, with cobblestone streets, white picket fences, and an old clock tower that rings every hour on the dot. But beneath that charm lies an atmosphere that hums with unease, like a painting hiding brushstrokes of decay under its surface. The Langridge family's influence has soaked into the soil, into the rhythm of everyday life, until even the air feels curated, rehearsed. Nothing in the town happens by accident, and no one forgets who truly owns it. The people who live there have long learned the art of silence. They greet each other with polite smiles, keep their voices low, and avoid asking questions that might travel too far. Gossip exists, of course, but it's whispered behind closed curtains, and only when the wind is loud enough to carry it away. The Langridge estate looms on the hill above the town, visible from nearly every street, a constant reminder that someone is always watching. It doesn't matter if they actually are, the illusion of surveillance is enough to keep everyone obedient. That's the kind of power the Langridges hold, not overt control, but the kind that makes people police themselves. Children grow up hearing two versions of the same stories, one told in classrooms, polished and proud, and another told in hushed tones at night when the lights are off. The first speaks of legacy, philanthropy, and the family's contributions to the town's prosperity. The second speaks of people who crossed them and disappeared, of land that was once communal but somehow became theirs, of promises made and never honored. Yet those darker stories are treated like folklore, dismissed as exaggerations of old grudges. No one dares to connect them to the smiling faces in the Langridge portraits hanging in City Hall. Even the landscape carries memory. The trees seem older near the estate, their roots gnarled and twisted as if gripping something beneath the ground. The river that runs past the town is said to change color during the winter, though no one agrees on what it turns into. Some say rust, others say red. The cobblestones on the main road have worn smooth from decades of parades celebrating the family name, and the statues in the park always face the mansion, never the people. Everything in the town exists to serve as both tribute and warning. It's a beautiful place, but beauty here is deceptive, and the stillness that fills the streets is not peace, it's the quiet that comes when everyone knows the rules of survival. And then, the ground gave up its secret. Not with a scream, but with the soft, crumbling sound of earth turning over, a sound that would unravel 80 years of perfect, polished silence. The town's silence is not born from ignorance but from a collective choice to forget. It's the kind of quiet that doesn't come naturally, the kind that grows heavy over time, pressing down until it becomes part of everyday life. People learn to avoid certain topics the same way they learn to avoid potholes on an old road, instinctively, without thinking. The Langridges are at the center of that silence, the unspoken rule that shapes every conversation, every cautious glance. No one tells you not to talk about them, but you just know not to. It's in the way people's voices lower when their name is mentioned, in how eyes dart toward the mansion and then away again, as if even looking too long might draw attention. This silence is generational. The older residents teach it to the younger ones, not through words but through behavior. When children ask innocent questions about the family, parents respond with vague answers or a sharp change of subject. Over time, curiosity dies out, replaced by the same fearful respect that binds the entire town. It's not just the Langridge's wealth or influence that commands this, it's the belief that they are untouchable. There are stories of people who tried to expose them or question their power. None of those stories end well. Some lose their jobs, others move away overnight, and a few simply stop being mentioned. Their absence becomes another kind of silence, another lesson. The church, the school, even the local paper all play their parts in maintaining the quiet. The preacher thanks the family for their generosity, the teachers recite a curated version of local history, and the journalists know better than to publish anything that hasn't been approved. It isn't corruption in the traditional sense, it's compliance born from fear disguised as loyalty. Everyone benefits, or at least appears to. The Langridges host grand events, sponsor repairs, donate to causes, and in return, the town pretends not to see the cracks forming beneath that surface. It's an exchange of comfort for truth, and over decades, it becomes so ingrained that even those who suspect something darker have forgotten how to speak it aloud. At night, when the town is quiet and the air thick with the scent of the Langridge gardens, that silence feels alive. It hums beneath the stillness, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. The people don't talk about the disappearances, the locked greenhouse on the edge of the estate, or why the ground near the far wall of the garden always looks freshly turned. They've convinced themselves that silence keeps them safe. But silence, when stretched over decades, doesn't protect, it hides, and beneath the surface of their collective quiet, Something has been buried for far too long. The whispers about the Langridge family never came from outsiders. They were born within the town itself, murmured in kitchens, passed along in half-finished sentences, and buried beneath polite laughter. The stories were always the same, never proven, yet never forgotten, that their fortune wasn't inherited through mere business, but through something much darker. Some said the Langridges had ties to the disappearances that dotted the town's history, names that faded quietly from memory with no official explanation. Others believed that the family's influence came from a kind of pact, not one written on paper but sealed through generations of silence and obedience. These weren't wild rumors shouted in the streets. They were the kind whispered by those who swore they weren't superstitious but couldn't shake the feeling that something about the Langridges wasn't right. Old records told little about where their money first came from. The family's first patriarch, Thomas Langridge, had arrived in town with no clear past, just wealth, charm, and a promise to build a better future. And he did. He built factories, housing, and schools, shaping the town's identity in his image. But with his rise came strange events that no one could explain. A fire at a rival mill, a missing business partner, a child found wandering the outskirts claiming to have lived in the Langridge estate before her family moved away. These incidents were dismissed, documented only in the fading memories of those who dared recall them. Each generation carried on the same way, polished smiles, public generosity, and private mystery. The Langridges attended every major town event, dressed impeccably, their presence always expected and always unsettling. There was something too deliberate about them, as if they were performing goodness rather than living it. When accidents happened on their land, no one questioned it. When land changed ownership overnight, no one asked for records. It was easier that way. The rumors became part of the town's folklore, a blend of admiration and fear that grew with each retelling. And then there was the garden. Every Langridge heir expanded it, each adding something new: a fountain, a hedge maze, a greenhouse that stayed locked year-round. The garden was their pride, but also their shield. Townsfolk said the soil there was unusually rich, that flowers grew faster and brighter than anywhere else. Some joked that the family fed the garden more than just water. Others didn't find it funny. Still, no one ever refused the Langridge's hospitality when invited to stroll through its manicured paths. You smiled, you complimented the roses, and you never, ever asked what made them bloom so beautifully. 7 graves. That was the count. 7 secrets the earth had held on to, each one a life that had crossed the Langridges and paid the ultimate price. But the real horror wasn't the number, it was how long they had been there, blooming beneath the roses, waiting. The Langridge estate was not just a home, it was a monument. Its grandeur towered over the town like a silent overseer, a constant reminder of who truly ruled. The house itself was ancient, built from pale stone that caught the morning light and made it appear almost holy from afar. Ivy curled around the columns as if nature itself bent to decorate it, and iron gates, intricate and heavy, marked the boundary between ordinary life and the Langridge's domain. Everything about the place felt deliberate, as if it had been designed not for comfort but for reverence. To step through those gates was to step into another world, one of manicured precision, where the air was unnaturally still and the sound of your own footsteps seemed too loud. Visitors often described the estate as breathtaking, but not warm. It was the kind of beauty that demanded silence, a beauty meant to be admired from a distance. The mansion's windows were tall and narrow, its corridors long and echoing, lined with portraits of the family's ancestors staring down in somber judgment. Servants moved like ghosts through those halls, efficient and unseen, trained to disappear before anyone remembered their faces. No one ever said they were mistreated, but no one ever stayed long either. The turnover was constant, the explanations vague. It was as though the house itself consumed those who lingered too long. But it was the garden that captured everyone's attention. Acres of it stretched behind the estate, hedges cut into perfect symmetry, marble statues frozen mid-motion, fountains that never stopped flowing. It was the Langridge family's pride, a spectacle they flaunted to guests during their famous summer gatherings. Yet, even in its beauty, something about it felt unnatural. The colors were too vivid, the flowers too full, blooming long past their seasons. Some locals said the garden never died, even in winter, its soil always damp and fragrant as though something beneath it kept it alive. Few people ever entered the far side of the garden, where the trees grew thicker and the paths faded into shadow. The family called it their old quarter, a section that had been part of the original estate and, according to them, left untouched out of respect for history. But workers who had tended the grounds whispered otherwise. They spoke of soft earth, of tools that sank too easily, of finding bones that didn't belong to animals. Of course, those stories never left the gates. The Langridges paid well, and their reputation ensured silence. Still, even the bravest gardeners avoided that corner when the sun began to set. The air there grew colder, heavier, as if the ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone foolish enough to dig too deep. The Langridge garden was the family's masterpiece, the crown jewel of their legacy, and yet it held an aura that unsettled anyone who lingered too long. To the townspeople, it was a place of wonder, sprawling rows of roses, manicured hedges that stretched into perfect lines, and marble statues gleaming white against the green. Visitors often described it as otherworldly, too pristine to be real, the kind of beauty that feels forced, as if sculpted to distract rather than to delight. The Langridges took great pride in it, hosting lavish garden parties where politicians, businessmen, and townsfolk mingled under lanterns that cast soft glows on the flowers. It was meant to symbolize prosperity and grace, a living emblem of the family's generosity. But behind its elegance, there was something hauntingly precise about it, every petal, every hedge, every path maintained with the kind of obsession that hides a deeper intention. Those who worked there said the garden never slept. It seemed alive in a way that nature isn't supposed to be. The roses bloomed even when frost bit at their leaves, the soil stayed moist no matter how long the sun blazed, and new growth always replaced the old, as if decay was forbidden. Gardeners came and went, each staying for a season or two before finding reasons to leave. They never spoke much about why. Some said the silence of the place unnerved them, no birds, no insects, not even the usual rustling of trees. Others claimed they heard faint sounds beneath the earth when they dug too deep, soft thuds like shifting stone or something heavier moving under the roots. The Langridges guarded the garden's secrets fiercely. Certain sections were off-limits, blocked by ornate iron gates with locks that no servant held keys to. The family called these areas heritage plots, explaining that they were part of the estate's original structure and not to be disturbed out of respect for their ancestors. But that explanation never sat right with anyone who'd been near them. Those corners of the garden always felt colder, darker, the soil softer than it should be. It was as if the earth there remembered something or someone. When guests walked through the main garden, the Langridges would smile and guide them along paths that showcased the most vibrant blooms, speaking with pride about the generations that had cared for it. No one ever questioned why the same flowers seemed to bloom in the exact same pattern year after year, or why the far wall of the garden was always freshly trimmed but never approached. It was easier to admire, to drink the champagne, and to pretend that perfection could grow without cost. The Langridge garden was more than a display of beauty, it was a mask, cultivated to conceal whatever truths had long been buried beneath its roots. In the end, the truth was buried again, not by soil, but by paperwork and privilege. The Langridges retreated behind their walls, and the town was left with a choice, to remember the horror, or to once again, choose the comfort of silence. The day the graves were discovered began like any other, with the kind of calm that only small towns know, still air, the faint hum of cicadas, and the sound of distant chatter from the market square. Workers had been sent to expand the irrigation lines that ran along the edge of the Langridge estate, a project the family themselves had commissioned. It was routine work, the kind that demanded more patience than skill. But beneath that perfect, sunlit calm, something waited. The soil had always been unusually soft in that part of the garden, the ground sinking slightly after heavy rain, though no one thought much of it. It wasn't until one worker's shovel struck something solid, something that didn't sound like rock, that the illusion of peace shattered. The noise echoed sharp and hollow through the garden, cutting through the hum of the day like a cry. At first, they thought it might be old construction debris, maybe a pipe, maybe a stone marker from the estate's early days. But as they brushed away the dirt, the outline began to take shape, smooth curves, then a faint edge, then something pale that caught the light in a way no stone should. One of the men stepped back, his breath catching before he said anything. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't stone. It was bone. The air changed immediately, turning cold and heavy. No one spoke. They just stared, as if saying it aloud would make it real. More digging followed, cautious and trembling. The foreman called for the police, but by then, the outline of the first body was already clear. It lay curled, as though it had been placed there gently, too gently. Then, as if the ground itself had decided to confess, another shape appeared beside it. And another. The workers uncovered 7 graves before they stopped counting, each buried close together, each without a coffin or a marker. The roots of nearby trees had grown through the remains, wrapping them like skeletal vines, as though nature itself had been trying to keep them hidden. Word spread faster than anyone could contain it. The Langridge mansion, once a symbol of order and power, now stood as a crime scene. The garden that had been the pride of the town became a field of unearthed horror. The townspeople gathered beyond the gates, their faces pale, their voices hushed in disbelief. Some wept, others prayed, but most simply stared not just at the graves, but at the home that had cast its shadow over them for generations. The day the graves were found, the town realized that the soil they'd walked on all their lives had never truly belonged to them. It belonged to the secrets that had been buried there long before any of them were born. When the news spread, disbelief rippled through the town like a cold wave. For a place that had spent decades living under the shadow of the Langridge name, the revelation felt impossible, almost sacrilegious. People gathered at the gates of the estate, whispering the same question over and over: whose graves were those? The authorities moved quickly, fencing off the garden, sending investigators and forensic teams, but their presence only deepened the unease. It wasn't just that 7 bodies had been found, it was that they had been found there, on the land that symbolized everything the town admired. The Langridge garden had been the stage for charity events, weddings, and countless photographs that now felt like glimpses into something grotesque. Every smiling face captured in those images suddenly seemed blind, every flower in those gardens tainted. The family, at least what remained of them, denied everything. They appeared calm, poised, almost rehearsed. Statements were made, lawyers were hired, and the narrative began to shift. They claimed the graves must have predated their ownership, that the land had once been part of an older property or a long-forgotten burial ground. To outsiders, it sounded plausible. To the townspeople, it sounded like another layer of the same deception that had kept them silent for generations. Still, no one spoke openly against them. Fear doesn't disappear overnight, even when the truth begins to surface. People still lowered their voices when mentioning the Langridges, as though the family might somehow hear and retaliate. As the investigation continued, the details grew darker. The bones were old decades, perhaps more, but not ancient. Some showed signs of trauma, of deliberate burial rather than ceremony. The town's archives turned up nothing about a cemetery on that land, and yet, when questions were raised, records began to go missing. Files misplaced, reports delayed, witnesses suddenly uncertain of what they'd seen. It was as if the same invisible hand that had shaped the town's silence was reaching out again, trying to pull the truth back underground. What struck people most wasn't the horror of what was found, but the revelation of how long they'd lived beside it. Generations of families had picnicked in the park overlooking the estate, worked on the grounds, attended galas beneath lanterns that illuminated the very soil hiding those bodies. The thought that they had danced, laughed, and raised glasses just feet away from the dead broke something in the town's collective spirit. The Langridge's power wasn't just in their wealth or their name, it was in the way they'd made everyone complicit through ignorance. The graves weren't just evidence of death, they were proof of a truth the town had chosen not to see, buried as carefully as the bodies beneath their feet. The discovery of the 7 graves didn't just unearth bodies, it unearthed the entire illusion the town had been living under for 80 years. What had once been pride now became shame, and every brick of the Langridge mansion seemed to breathe with guilt. Reporters flooded in, camera flashes reflecting off the iron gates that had once symbolized prestige, now rebranded as prison bars. The family, once untouchable, now looked cornered, their smiles forced, their poise unraveling under the scrutiny of the nation. But the strangest thing was how quiet the town became once again. For all the noise the media made, the people who had lived their lives under the Langridge shadow didn't speak. They watched, they listened, and deep down, they remembered that silence had always been their survival. The investigation unearthed layers of deceit that went beyond the graves. Bank records hinted at bribes, land acquisitions traced back to missing individuals, and private correspondences revealed a long-standing pattern of manipulation hidden beneath philanthropy. The garden, once a symbol of beauty and control, was now a crime scene swarming with officials. Each shovel of dirt turned up something new: fragments of jewelry, scraps of fabric, and bones that didn't belong to the same decade. It became clear that the graves hadn't all been dug at once. They were added slowly, methodically, over time. That realization turned horror into something far worse, the understanding that someone in the Langridge family had been maintaining those graves, tending to them just as they did their flowers. But justice in the town of Langridge never came easily. Files disappeared, testimonies changed, and the evidence that should have condemned the family seemed to dissolve under legal pressure. The investigation was quietly closed after months of confusion, declared inconclusive. The official story was that the graves were part of an unrecorded family burial plot, an explanation that satisfied paperwork but not the human heart. The Langridge estate was sealed off, its gates locked, the family retreating into private isolation. The garden grew wild, its flowers overrun by weeds, yet even then, the roses continued to bloom unnaturally bright, as if mocking the truth buried beneath them. Years passed, and the story faded into rumor again, whispered only by those old enough to remember. The mansion still stands on the hill, its windows dark, its garden reclaimed by nature. On quiet nights, some claim they can hear faint echoes from the earth, not cries, not movement, but something subtler. A sigh, maybe. The kind of sound that comes when secrets are too heavy to stay buried, even after everyone who kept them is gone. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit the bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.